journal selection and open access. I'm going to touch a little bit on the NIH open access policy or it's really public access policy, but I'm not going to spend too much time there because we have had a whole nother presentation on that topic. Oops, wrong button. Give me just okay, here we go. So, as I said, I'll refer to that. I'll link to that as well, but not spend much time on the NIH public access policy. So I'm going to talk about some vocabulary, key terms, a little bit on the NIH public access policy, as I mentioned, different types of journals, which is interesting because that's sort of changing very rapidly in the last few years. Jane, a tool for finding journals, a little bit about open access payments, and then a touch on predatory journals. So first with some of those key terms. I'm going to just mention some of these. I know a lot of you will know many or perhaps all of these, but just to be clear, the NIH is the U.S. National Institutes of Health, which funds a ton of biomedical research in the U.S., but also around the world. We'll, of course, be talking about open access, which is often referred to as OA, which means that it's freely available to the reader. Often there's kind of better copyright rules for the authors, and typically the authors have to pay a fee and the readers do not for open access. Then I'll touch on PubMed Central or PMC, which is a free repository that's part of NIH, and we'll talk more about it. The PMC ID is an identifier that's related to PubMed, the PubMed Central, which is technically different from the PubMed ID, which is PMID. Don't let that confuse you. They're quite similar. We might talk about embargo period, which is a period of time when some journals will have exclusive publication of an article before it becomes publicly available. So only their subscribers or people who pay would have access to it. And some things you might hear around this topic, but I'm not going to talk in depth, are gold open access and green open access. Gold open access is kind of fully open access. Everything is on the journal's website, and usually there's a fee for that. Green open access is like your article can be made publicly available, but not necessarily through the journal. So this might be the case for some of our NIH articles where the journal doesn't have free access, but they are published on PubMed Central because of their federal funding after an embargo period. And then Jane will talk about the journal author name estimator, which, as I said, is a search tool for identifying journals. You could also use it to find authors or specific articles. And if it's been a while since you've looked at Jane, I would take another look because it's still pretty simple, but it's had some updates in recent years that are kind of nice, and I'll show you some of those. So second then, going into the NIH public access policy. So this is important. It's actually recently been updated, but in general, the NIH public access policy just ensures that the public has access to the results of NIH funded research. Again, NIH is a government agency, so the government says it's only fair that if we're funding research, everybody should have access to it. And to make that happen, it requires researchers to submit the final manuscripts to that repository I mentioned, PubMed Central. This doesn't apply to any kind of writing, but it does apply to peer-reviewed manuscripts. So not things like book chapters or something, or editorials, which are not peer-reviewed. Being accepted after 2008, which has been a while now, so pretty much everything. and it arises from direct NIH funding. So that means that that this particular project had its funds used for this activity, even if it was only partially supported by that an NIH grant. So as a lot of our work at Gemini is NIH funded, most of our articles are going to comply with this policy. So as I said, you do have to deposit papers into PubMed Central for that. Again, I'm not going to go into detail. I'm going to link to this presentation that has, that has a lot more details on it. I'll drop that in the chat for people who are curious. And that's at the time of acceptance. And again, it says you must submit or have submitted for you. There's details in that other presentation about that, how that might work. And I'm going to touch on that when we talk about Jane. So you might be thinking, okay, if we have to put things on this repository, does that mean I can just publish my article for free on this repository? No, that's not really how it works. You still are going to have to publish in a journal, and then it's essentially indexed in this repository. So if you're using an open access journal, you still might have to pay, or if it's a subscription journal, obviously you're still going to have to get your journal accepted. You might not be paying. Readers might have to pay a fee, but you can't just archive a paper in PMC without being accepted by a peer-reviewed journal. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or we'll talk at the end. And then another important thing about the public access policy is that we have to cite, using the PMC ID, any of these works that come from NIH projects in any kind of communication with NIH. So that means new proposals, progress reports, final reports. Whenever we're giving anything formal to NIH and we're using citations, we have to include the PMC ID. This seems like a little bit tedious, but it's very important, because if you don't show that you're following this policy, it could result in an award being delayed, or worst case scenario, potentially withheld because you weren't complying with this policy, okay? So it's pretty important. Again, more guidance is there, and for the sake of time, I won't go into that whole thing in extreme detail. I want to spend more time on some of the other things. So now that we know we need to make things open access, let's see what kinds of journals we have. Conventional journals or subscription journals, back in the day, this was really all that we had. Like literally like the kind of magazine style print journals that used to come to people's homes or offices because they paid to subscribe to them, or their institution, their university subscribed to them. So typically the authors didn't pay for those. And I say in the past tense, but they still do kind of exist. The author wouldn't have paid for those, but the subscribers, the readers would. Nowadays, with everything online, those can still be subscriptions, kind of digital subscriptions, or some people still do receive print journals, or pay-per-view fees. I'm sure some of you have seen this when you are doing a review and you find an article and it says, okay, pay $30 to view this particular article, that kind of thing. And some conventional journals still may provide access after embargo periods, but they kind of have exclusive rights to the content for 6 or 12 months. And then open access journals don't require readers to pay at all. They may sell ads, but they typically require authors to pay. Not always, but most commonly, authors are paying article processing charges, or they may have waivers or other agreements. You may see article processing charges abbreviated as APC, which can vary pretty greatly, but $900 to $2,000 is pretty typical. It's not uncommon to see something up to $3,000, but it can even be significantly more. So these are quite expensive fees, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And then lastly, there's hybrid journals, which, as it sounds like, are sort of in between. So these journals make it's on an article by article basis. So these journals make some articles freely available, and others are behind a paywall or require you to be a subscriber. And this is typically the option that the author gets at the time of submission or the time of acceptance, whether to make it open access or subscription only. So those are called hybrid journals, as it sounds like. You could do either one. So there's a few examples here of conventional open access and hybrid journals. I wanted to note that I know a lot of us are really familiar with these like pure open access journals, but when I was preparing for this presentation, I was finding actually it's fewer and fewer journals are going with the conventional model because people are really demanding open access, I think. And so even, you know, some of these very big, influential, long-standing subscription-based journals are offering open access options, more like a hybrid journal. So even Annals of Emergency Medicine, which we think of in this field of emergency medicine as like pretty much like the gold standard, long-standing journal that would have been very conventional in the past, offers open access options nowadays. So, so I found that pretty interesting. And I wanted to note as well, I think this sentiment is existing less and less, but there's not really, just because something is open access or conventional doesn't necessarily mean that the quality is any better or worse. There's plenty of variability in all of these categories. So in the past, there used to be this attitude, you know, 10, 15 years ago that open access was just crap and like anybody could publish in open access journal. But many of these open access and certainly hybrid journals are having very high impact factors. They're getting harder and harder to publish in. So it's not like it's just some kind of blanket thing. Now, don't be fooled because you can get in some trouble there, but we'll get to that in the end. Okay, next we'll talk about Jane. So as I said, this is the journal author name estimator. And there is a link, which it's great to kind of play around with. I told you too that you could find authors. This is helpful when you have journals in the submission process where you're required to identify potential reviewers, because you might not know who to suggest besides your own friends, which is obviously not recommended because of conflict of interest. But if you put your abstract or your title of your journal in here, you can find authors that have worked on similar topics. Now, a lot of times you end up finding your same colleagues because they're working on the same topics. So you have to kind of scramble things up a little bit to find people who don't have a conflict of interest. But what I'm talking about using it here for is finding journals. This is a really cool tool. You can insert the title or abstract. You can scramble up the words, which helps, again, like not find people who are like your own work as much. And you just search. It's just a search engine. And so here's an example of how it works. You know, you just paste this is just an abstract that was pasted in here. And then this is how it comes out. And as I said, there's been some improvements recently because some of these tags, I don't remember them having some of these before. This is super helpful. So this is the output. I put in this article, and you can kind of tell by the topics that come up that was about this kind of mHealth intervention or something. So that's why we're having all this like mHealth or you know, innovation type of journals. So what it's telling you here with confidence on the left side is and that's how they're ranked in order of confidence, how likely it is that your work is a match. Then obviously it has the names of the journals, and it has some of these tags: high quality, open access. Not sure how they exactly assess that, but if you were to go and hover over, it will define it. Medline index, and very importantly, PMC. So any of them that have PMC, they mean they're going to index your article on PMC for you, which means it's going to comply with the NIH policy without you doing a bunch of legwork. So that's a really good sign for us. So if we see PMC, we're happy. And if you want to look at open access versus not, that's obviously something helpful. You can see at a glance with the tags that are here. And then the influence, this is sort of like an impact factor analog where it's giving you an idea of like how kind of another measure kind of how good it is. And then if you click show articles, it would show you some titles of articles which you could click and look into that sound like they're similar to yours based on the search term that you use. So you can see, oh, this article is, if they accepted this article, probably they're likely to accept mine. This is super helpful when you're dealing with something that you are having a hard time finding a home with, you know, if you're getting a lot of rejections or you have some very particular topic and you don't know what journal to go to, this tool is very helpful. There's other considerations besides, you know, just kind of this match that Jane is going to give you. Special issues are something that's really helpful to look out for. Once you start kind of getting into the networks of some of these journals, you'll learn about special issues they have, which are going to be like on particular topics. And this is going to increase the chances of your article being accepted and published in that journal. And sometimes there's other benefits to using those special issues as well. It's important to note to look at the different journal instructions to see what types of articles they accept, because sometimes they have very particular criteria for different kinds of articles, like editorials or you know, full-length articles. Some might not accept any review articles, for example. And then maximum word counts. This is especially helpful if you know that your paper is going to be lengthy. This happens a lot with our qualitative research. The more conventional print journals often have more smaller word counts because they're having to pay to print on literal pages your article. There may be even restrictions on color usage and figures. So it's important to read the instructions for authors if those kinds of issues might come up for you. And in some of our, when we prepare, when we're starting to like make a list of potential journals, if it's relevant to our case, we're going to note that when we find the potential journals. Here's an example of the way that we recommend doing it and we like to do it. Again, I might add a column here if we had like a really long mixed methods article. I might add a column for word count, for example, because I'm going to have to rule things in or out based on the word count or maybe trim them. So here's an example that Alice pulled together for the implementation science paper. So she used Jane to identify things that were relevant on implementation science and then put in here, you know, this is obviously a hybrid journal because it's free or paid. We put that as a high on this list because we don't have money for this particular work to publish. So we need to publish it in this way. Noting the impact factor is important as well. And then Alice noted fee waivers. I'm going to get into fee waivers a little more. But for those of you that haven't had to deal with some of these article processing charges, you can see this is in, I'm pretty sure this is in US dollars. Sometimes some of the journals put them in like pounds or euros, but quite expensive. So then, yeah, as I said, I'm going to talk about paying for open access. So the first thing you need to do, as I said, when you're kind of making that list, is check the journal website to identify what are the article processing charges for that journal. During the submission process, this often comes up. So this is like an example of what it looks like in this Lancet submission process, where it's kind of giving you a heads up. Hey, this is a gold open access journal. Everything has an article processing charge. Click here to learn about it, and you have to agree at the time of submission to doing this. Yeah, so here's an example of like what that Lancet page says. Lancet Global Health is one of the most expensive, charging $5,000 to authors for full-length papers. There are waivers. So this is an example of the text that they have here, where in this particular case, they say, if all authors are from this kind of country, if all authors are from this country, then they get a full waiver. If they're all from a B country or a mix of A and B countries, they could get a 50% waiver, but this varies greatly from journal to journal. So you really have to look at the particular journals. If you want to avoid paying them or get support for APCs, of course, choosing a conventional journal or a hybrid journal and choosing the free option is fine. Again, if it's NIH sponsored work, you don't have to worry about the public having access to it, because after a potential embargo period, it will be indexed on PubMed Central because of its NIH funding. So you can still choose a conventional journal and have it be open access if it's NIH funded. As I said, there's some waivers. A lot of journals offer waivers for part or all of the article processing charge. It often needs to be indicated at the time of submission. And they may have rules that you have to read very carefully, like the corresponding author has to meet this criteria, like being from a lower middle income country, or the first author has to meet this criteria, or the funder location, or the majority of the authors, things like that. So you just have to look through, because each journal is a little bit different. This is like one criteria that a lot of journals use when determining eligibility for waivers. So you can see, most African countries are eligible for at least some of a waiver, a lot of Latin American areas, but it varies, and this does get updated over time. And then also, if you accept the fee and are looking for support, a lot of universities, including Duke, have agreements where they've agreed to waivers or discounted fees for some publishers. Different universities will have different agreements with other publishers or these same publishers. So if you have co-authors from other universities, for example, Utah or UNC has different journals that they have contracts with. If you have co-authors from these different institutions, you might be eligible for these waivers. Again, just like with the other waiver details, you may have to indicate that at the time of submission. And there are probably rules about, maybe it has to be the corresponding author that's affiliated with that institution, or even the majority of authors or something like that. So make sure you're reading the fine print to see if it applies at the time of submission, because you don't want to get stuck with a fee or have to change your journal after it's already been gone through revisions and things like that. So these are some of the publishers that Duke has current agreements with. I'll flag, and there's a link here as well. I'll flag the Cambridge University Press is probably the most likely of these that you'll find journals that are relevant to our work. There's a ton of journals. A lot of them are kind of humanities based, but many are health and medicine. So take a look at those if you're looking for journals that we have agreements with. And then also funder support. A lot of, I might even say most grants allow for the inclusion of article processing charges in the budget. So like NIH will allow for that. And in some cases, depending on your funder, you may be able to go back and ask for additional support for those kinds of things. I've seen that work out, but it's not super common, I'll say. And lastly, just wanted to touch on predatory journals. So being, as we said, we're facing down these exorbitant fees for journals, you can see that there's a lot of opportunity for making money. So some of these opportunists, even criminals, will take advantage of this and our desire as scientists to publish. They know that we're desperate to get things published. There are some lists online that you can find, but the problem is it's like whack-a-mole, where there's always new ones coming up. And really sadly, there's a lot of journals that go from being kind of reputable and they're sort of hijacked and become just garbage predatory journals. Some things to look out for, and not necessarily always a problem, but look out for if you get direct email solicitations and the emails are just bad emails. I'll show you an example. if they're missing information on their email or their website that like just looks suspicious, if their impact factor is something you can't confirm from any other source, if there's not actually a lot of literature available on their website, um, or you can't find it on a legitimate index service like PubMed, and if they offer, expedited peer review, red flag. Okay, that means they're not doing any peer review. So here's an example of an email that I got, which is just like red flag after red flag. So this is exactly the kind of thing, I know a lot of you guys have had these, but if they're like bending over and being like, oh my gosh, we're so desperate. We just need one article to release our next issue. Can you help us? Um, you might have to pay a fee, but we're going to make you a deal if you do this quickly. And then like the language is really bad. So look out for this. It can look kind of legit, but if you've never heard of this thing and it's coming out of nowhere, certainly be suspicious. Okay. And if you're ever in doubt, just share it with somebody. Say, hey, look at this. This doesn't look like right. Can you look at this? That's all I have for now. I would love to hear from folks in the chat, or if you want to unmute, feel free to share, especially if you have, yeah, exactly, Emily. If you have certain journals that you think are very great to work with, especially if we're able to get some reduced article processing charges or no article processing charges, please feel free to share. But thanks. Yeah, Liz.
Ashley, thanks so much. This was so super helpful. I wanted to ask a quick question about the difference between the kind of conventional, the hybrid, and the open access. In your experience, have you found that they make that pretty clear on the website, or is it sometimes a little bit like harder to find? Um,
So
because
yeah,
yeah.
that's a good question. So when they're pure open access, like that Lancet one that I showed you, if they call themselves gold open access, or there's a new thing that you're seeing come out, which is diamond open access, which is fun. If they're true pure open access, they will say that and they will put it everywhere. And then you'll know, okay, you're pure open access. It's harder to identify when they're the other way around, because they might make reference to open access, meaning like it's an option. And then you might think, oh, well, it's an option for everyone, or can I choose? That's a little bit harder to see. And so often for a lot of these details, you kind of have to fish through the publisher and the journal website to make sense of it. Sometimes you might even have to go into like the manuscript submission system to see more details. But usually, especially when there are article processing charges, they're pretty upfront about that, because they know that you need to know, like, before you go forward with this, okay, what kind of costs are we talking about? And if there's waivers, what kind of waivers are we talking about? So it can be a little bit tricky to find, yeah. Other questions or comments, suggestions? Any horror stories or good stories? We have a horror story.
We have a horror story. Yeah. So one of our master students found a great journal, we thought. We applied to it and it was accepted within 24 hours. So we knew there was a problem immediately. And then we tried to withdraw. And at which point we started getting angry emails to the point of like
Every
obnoxious,
day.
screaming at us emails every day for weeks. So we had to go to legal to be able to say, what do we do? What do we do with this paper? Do we just lose the whole paper because they said that it's published now? So now we have to pay them, and so that they have a copyright on it. And so we like couldn't
Right.
publish it somewhere else. Ashley, we ended up publishing it somewhere else, right? And we just made an argument that they.
So what we ended up doing is it's only on a preprint. So the preprint, we can point to that, we can cite that, but no other journal is going to publish our article because it's already published. Like, they don't want to be in a copyright problem with these criminals.
Yeah.
And And we can't get this predatory site to take it down, because the thing is, the reason they're successful at this is because, as I said, they keep cropping up under different names. And even if somebody does try to bring any legal action, which is very difficult because they're usually overseas somewhere, it doesn't really result in anything effective. So there's very little we can do. So we have to be cautious up front, because once they have their hands on your content, there's very little you can do about it. Yeah. And you don't want to cite that journal, and you don't want your name to be associated with that journal and other people think it's legit, right? So it's very risky business. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Leticia put some more about predatory journals. Did you want to add anything there, Leticia?
Not only we need not only to note about the grammar in the email, the messy website, but sometimes the faster publication rate, the self-citation, like MDPI, not seem like a predatory journal sometimes, but they have a lot of predatory practice too.
Interesting. Yeah, and like I said, it's really unfortunate when it's getting common where these journals are kind of like bought or like hijacked by folks, and then because then it gives it that legitimacy where you're thinking, oh, this was on PNC before, like it was
Yeah.
PubMed indexed before, so it looks legit. But then you find it's really no longer looking that way.
I believe it's not all of MDPI journals, but some of the journals have this predatory practice. And I heard even Frontiers, some journals have suspicious ways to work.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Leticia. Anyone else want to share any questions or comments or suggestions?
So I'll just share some best practices. So one of the things that we do when we are finishing a paper before it goes out to all reviewers for their feedback is that I'll make a table of all of the potential journals, like 10 of them, to potential journals to send to, what the impact factor is, what the cost for open access is, what the options for open access are, so that we can make an informed decision as all of the reviewers on the paper to say, hey, I wouldn't go to this one. That's a predatory one. I've had that experience, and or we don't have any money. So let's figure out how to get this published at open access if possible, but if not, then not, right? And so making that table ahead of time is really helpful for everyone who's reviewing the paper to also see the journals. Because there can be a mismatch, right? So if you're trying to go to Lancet, and yet the data is like 30 people in a quantitative study, like that's not going to make it, right? And so it allows the reviewer of the paper to really give some feedback there and be like, maybe not Lancet on this one, maybe on the next one, and make sure that it's within the realm of the requests for the journal itself.
Yeah, good point. And to that point, we need to declare at the time of submission that all the authors agree to the submission to whatever journal. So they need to be aware. You don't want to be giving a co-author an automatically generated email saying, oh, you're a co-author on this paper submitted to blah, blah, blah journal I've never heard of, as a surprise. So make sure everyone is aware. Emily, another thought?
I had a question about stuff that is NIH funded. So if it's, if I'm thinking about my K award and I publish in the World Journal of Surgery, but I don't pay for open access,
Yep.
that's okay, right? As long as I put the like, how does that work with the repository?
Yeah, it should be. You got to check like each journal. So usually the journal will indicate, and often at the time of submission, that's why they will ask you, like, was this funded by NIH or funded by another funder that requires that? And so if it was, they know it needs to be deposited into this index. That's where on Jane, if it had that like PMC tag, that means, and if you might want to go to that that other slide set that I shared first, because that has a bunch of details about the different types of journals. So there's kind of like 4 different things I think that the journals will do. There's journals that are like, we put everything in PMC. There's journals that say basically, if you ask us, we'll put it in PMC. And then there's ones that it's like, okay, you have to do the legwork and you have to like deposit it yourself, which is doable, but kind of a pain. So you kind of just have to look at the journal website. But yes, generally you can still have your article published on a closed access journal and have it indexed in PMC.
Right. Okay, good. That feels like breaking the rules, but it's certainly what I've
Yeah.
done. I
Yeah,
mean, when they
it's
ask, I mean,
ideal
yeah,
for
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 NIH.
authors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some, you know, some there, when I was looking into this some more again, I was, there were some moral arguments about hybrid journals in general and kind of like, going with subscription journals and things that, does it not, bring as much attention to those articles? And so, there's some debate to be had, but it would comply with the policy as long as it's archived in PMC. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. All this, the predatory stuff is so confusing as a new researcher. Like I remember that just being, you get emails of, dear awesome researcher, come be our keynote in Spain, plus we'll publish you. Like it's, I don't know, I just felt like I just kept sending all the emails to the mentor and asking, is this legit? And so that's totally fine to do when we're learning.
Yeah, I mean, certainly better to ask for an opinion than to go through with something that sounds too good to be true.
Yeah.
I still do it now. Forget learning, right? I send this
Yeah,
stuff
Catherine
to
sends
Ashley
it
and
to me
Joao. I'm
all
like,
the time.
this does not seem right. And they're like, it's not. I'm like, oh, thank
Yeah.
God.
Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for sharing some thoughts and questions. This, as I said, this will be a lot of some